This is Adam Ray Adkins, aka Dirt, Son of Earth. You're going to hear a conversation between myself, Mike Watson, and Terry Tapp. We're going to speak on acid communism, getting straight into it. Why acid and why communism? We're going to touch on psychedelic substances. We're going to touch upon aesthetics, actually existing communism. We're going to touch on where communism will go in the 21st century, if and why this is a desirable term. We have this conversation on twitch.com/leftcanmeme. That's Mike Watson's channel where we regularly host the Theory Wave Nights show, where we have live VJ sets to songs of a psychedelic and theoretical nature. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
And where were we?
We were talking about the effect of psychedelics and the actual.
Yeah, psychedelics. So, I mean, the question I put to Terry is, how crucial is the psychedelic experience to acid communism? Let's start just saying for you, what do you think?
Well, I don't think that any individual necessarily has to take a psychedelic drug, but I don't want to overlook the impact of psychedelics on our culture. Psychedelics tend to be boundary dissolving. They change their sense of humor. If you look at the sense of humor at the stand-up routines we had in the early 1960s and before, and you look at those afterward, I believe Terence McKenna made this point. You know, the sense of humor is deeper. It's more aware of or touches on the awareness of a reality tunnel, a particular perception, and you see terms like reality tunnel, like my reality, coming in after the late 60s when the use of psychedelics was at its peak. I think drugs like that have broadened our awareness, and I think that even if you're not taking them, the continual use by even a small number of people in the populace is kind of vital. And I have to qualify that by saying it also has to be in the right context. I've been around people on psychedelic drugs, and by drugs, I'm including, of course, all types of plants and anything that can alter your consciousness in that psychedelic sense. People on those who are not really respectful. And I've been in situations and used them myself in the proper contexts, meaning a respectful, usually private context, that are very life-changing. So that context needs to be respected. It's not simply the use of psychedelic drugs, but in the right context.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking, I suppose that the term acid in acid communism is a kind of modifier of communism. No, that you have communism, which is a very rigid form. I mean, in its kind of base form, this kind of idea of communitarianism is potentially very open, but we tend to understand what we call big C communism as something very restrictive, something, even totalitarian. So I guess the kind of jokey part, and Mark Fisher has said that the term acid communism is what he called a serious joke. So it's kind of a jokey term, but with some kind of incisive political potential. But, the kind of jokey part is that it takes communism as this kind of severe form, and it makes it somehow playful, or maybe takes off the hard edges and makes it something more kind in a way. If you think about psychedelia as being something where people come together and kind of lose their boundaries, and it being somehow some kind of, loving, some kind of, free love experience or something. So I guess that's the purpose. But then, of course, whether one is going to sell that to any kind of significant portion of the population, as long as psychedelia is seen as an important element. You see what I mean? So, I mean, I think, okay, great. I'm like, I don't do any drugs for years, incidentally, but I mean, I do drink alcohol. But I don't do psychedelics. But I mean, I think when I did, I have some experiences which are very influential on my development. But, you know, how does one formalize this as a movement? I'm just wondering, because I think, and I'll put it to Adam, you know, I think that the term acid for Mark Fisher, it had many different meanings. So I'm just wondering, you know, what might have been the other meanings and how they fit into the obvious psychedelic meaning.
So I'll touch on that a little bit because I wanted to say this already after Terry, but I think this is a good way to segue into it. Is the psychedelic doesn't have to be specifically drugs, although I am with Terry there that I think they do occupy an important part of it, simply because of how easy that concept is to illustrate with LSD in a metaphorical sense. And then quite literal with LSD and brain chemistry. But, you know, even mass media has a psychedelic effect, especially through it when it's introduced into culture. It changes the way people are perceiving everything around them. It can change the very way they perceive their neighborhoods, their country, their nation. And then with smaller forms, well, I guess still mass media, but with music, with songs, with psychedelic music, not all of it was drug-induced. And even if it was inspired by something like LSD, it wasn't completely written on, recorded, and everything under LSD. It's like those moments were taken back into something where you have stretched out sounds that almost transform the way you feel. Today, you have things like ASMR, which are kind of playing with some of that, where audio sounds are inducing physical sensations within people and kind of making them change how they think about stuff. I mean, it's usually pretty benign, sometimes erotic, sometimes silly. You know, and then there's even people playing around with reading ASMR theory. I think there's capitalist realism read as an ASMR video, you know? So you're supposed to listen to this and get chills coming down, and like those kind of signal emotional shifts in people, or they can. But then most importantly, when it comes to the metaphor and reality of LSD specifically, we look at studies where they're using these psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, mushrooms, even things like ketamine on people to treat mental illness or bouts of depression, things like that. They're using these, and it's not the experience itself that is the most important thing. Obviously, that's like the easy thing to talk about. It's where you get these perceived insights and whatnot. But then for months after, these people's physical neurology is changed, and through that change and through the reflection upon the experience, that's where a lot of real work, I think, is done. And that's something that, especially in the memification of acid communism, is kind of glossed over, and something that probably should be brought more to the foreground. And maybe that has to do with how acid communism, or any movement really, goes from being a meme thing, from this digital world, from the world of the ideal, into a more material practice, how these things take hold through communities, through situations or happenings, how they're implemented in the real life through, you know, with other people as autonomous things. Even some of them can be, you know, international movements, which is, I think, as communists, something that we should aim for.
Well, I think that's the point. Mark Fisher, you know, in Capitalist Realism, pointed out that we can't really conceive of a world beyond capitalism. And I think that's the point of the term acid, the adjective. And that is that you can move past these stalemates and your conceptualization. We don't have a real cultural left. I mean, the news media, at least in the United States, like to pretend we do. We don't really have a cultural left. We don't have a good Dickens right now. We don't have a Zola. We don't have these kind of people who are pushing us to unite our emotions with our politics. Our emotions are joined with monstrous types of policies. And so if you can conceive of taking a hammer to those emotional bulwarks, so to speak, then you're doing something like acid does. When you take good acid, you see beyond the possibilities of your daily life, those quotidian moments. And so with acid communism, my idea of communism as a lived experience is a nightmare. It's Stalin and Mao and these horrible things. But in actual communism, we don't know what that would be, other than that there's some sort of egalitarianism of opportunity, that we share and we own the means of production, these basic things. But once you introduce this term of acid in there, there's a playfulness that comes back into it that moves past those monstrosities of the 20th century and capitalist monstrosities as well. I don't want to simply dig into a Stalin or a Mao. But once you move past those with this playful idea of acid, this open-ended idea of acid, anything goes, and you could be, you're given the permission by yourself to play, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, but this anything goes is something that, is cause for concern. In some sense, if you've been following, which you both have actually, and we've talked about it in different forums, but we can go through it here. But following the kind of online left in the last couple of years, and the growing extremism of the online left as a response, I guess, to the extremism of the alt-right and other kind of far rights online. I think that the alt-right very much kind of grew up with this notion that anything goes. It's kind of like a nihilistic right wing, which has appealed to many young people, because I think that at a certain age that there is a tendency to kind of to play with ethics, to kind of like to turn around and to try and disregard the ethics that your parents and your schooling gave you. So I think it's actually quite late teens and into your 20s when you get into this kind of like what we call today edgelordism. But I was certainly doing it in my late teens and 20s, and I imagine you both were. And so, I can totally get that. But, I think there's a risk that the acid in the acid communism is almost a license to say and do anything. As such, you get a kind of blurring of the boundaries, that if you're going to give a free rein ethically to that extent, then people might be tempted to say, okay, then why can't we just say something ridiculous, even racist or sexist or whatever in an acid communist forum? So, the acid part kind of potentially can blur the boundaries to such an extent that the far left becomes like the current far right. So how are we? How are we going to?
Some boundaries, actually.
Yeah.
I would cut off any type of reactionary element, like what we're seeing from the far right, that is boundary dissolving, is actually just a boundary for human decency. It's not any sort of interesting anti-capitalist, post-capitalist boundary dissolution. It's just going back to what maybe their grandfather had said about black people.
Yeah,
it's not interesting in any way.
No, it's not really. It's unfortunately very interesting because it's so terrible in a way. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean I know how you meant it. I suppose the question is, how does one impose boundaries, or how does one come up with a structure to something that's called acid communism?
Well, I think that going back to the basic left precept that those who do the work have to own the means of production, have to own the tools, the factory, the farm, whatever it is, the computer, the copyright. I don't know whatever we want to put on that, but that basic idea, I think, grounds us away from this idea of oppressing other people. And the alt-right and these rightist notions are grounded in taking more power than we are allotted. We are allotted meaning as ourselves. Not that we have by any means, but once you have that, once you understand that you have a certain amount of power and other people have their own power, I think that imposes a natural limit to where you can go that we call communism.
But that brings us to another point. And actually, I wanted you to lead this a bit. So I'm maybe going to pass it to you, Terry, to then retake up the kind of presenter role, and then maybe kind of start putting the questions back to me and Adam. But before that, we keep going back to the acid part being a kind of modifier of the communist part. And the communist part, at least for us, and then this is going to be hugely controversial amongst other people watching, and then hopefully audiences later on YouTube or wherever. But we're all a little bit dubious about the value of the term communism, or at least, historically. So we've already had the why acid, but now, we might ask why communism. We're almost actually putting together two quite difficult terms that both alone, but then even more together, are only ever going to appeal to a very narrow demographic of already kind of edgelords, in a sense, or even if they're not full-on edgelords. But okay, so just maybe to Adam first, and then maybe Terry, you take over a bit the presentation. Adam, why communism? Is this even desirable?
Right. So yeah, earlier you said that the psychedelic or acid aesthetic or modifier was perhaps too undesirable to a general public. Well, at least in America, communism is far more undesirable to the general public. I know soccer moms that, like the hippie aesthetic, and finding someone to embrace historical communism is going to be a lot harder than that. But why? Is it more of a provocation? Should it be socialism instead? Should it be, I think online acid communism gets lumped in with a very weak democratic socialism often. And I don't want to necessarily embrace that, or embrace that at all, despite being a pretty big advocate for Sanders for president. Because I think there holds something true about what Zizek has said recently when using the word communism. And it's something along the lines of anyone can claim to be a socialist today. Bill Gates will say he's a socialist. If socialism simply means, a more humanitarian capitalism, then a lot of people can get behind it. So the question really comes to imagining more, and linking back to owning the means of production, to communist theory, to Marxism, and taking that much more seriously. But then you do have to distance yourself to a lot of degrees to historically actually existing 20th century communism. And I don't think communism in the 21st century will look like that. I don't think it's desirable or sellable.
I think inevitably there's already somebody, T4S Gaming, who's kind of quite aggrieved in the comment section at the notion that we should drop the name communism because it has a bad name amongst right wingers and it's seen as edgy, etc. And he's saying, is the question worth asking? We don't need to bend our knees and change the name of a movement, etc. But I mean, that's why it's a question, because then we can get to this kind of thing. And Adam's saying that, well, that was communism in some places in the last century, and in this century, it wouldn't necessarily be that. But you have to consider that there's a strong, a large part of the population that if Jeremy Corbyn, for example, says, let's renationalise parts of British Telecom in Britain, the telecom network, so that we can offer free broadband, he's then called a communist. And then people are like, communist, we can't vote for him. So I'm just kind of thinking about, the viability of a movement on a large scale that melds two words together, acid, which is something that probably scares a lot of people, and communism, which is something that scares a lot of people.
But are you looking for a movement?
We might not be those people, but it's just a question, what do we think communism is?
Are you looking for a movement that people vote for, though?
No, not necessarily. No, but I'm just trying to get to this T4S gaming person to kind of explain why the question was put like that. But I mean,
I do think it's important. What you're saying is, we're not or at least the idea is not to advocate Stalinism, but with tie-dye T-shirts. That's not the idea. It will have to be different. There is a distinction between a lot of that. So what do you learn from those? And beyond that, in some sense, it doesn't matter to me what that is called at the end of the day. I identify with communism because I see a rich history in it. And despite a lot of the disagreements with USSR and much more with Maoism or something like that, there is things there, and they do stem and have ties to genuine people's revolts for liberation and a freer society where there is more creative control and the hope of humanity producing itself.
Yeah, I see, to me, what we're doing by producing something called acid communism is not trying to solicit membership, but to provide an equator. If you're trying to understand a political and imaginative terrain, then you need an actual cartography. And I think one thing we lack now is a real, you called it edgelord, but a dark, very punchy, far left edgelord system, a real acid communism. When you get in a fight, you don't want to find that middle ground immediately. You want to be an aggressor. And so when you read about the left, I would prefer the Corbyns, even the Sanders, to be perceived as the soft left, and acid communism to be those who need to be feared. Feared in the sense of so extreme and so open to possibility, so potentially freeing, that you have to consider if they're going to leave the earth. If you can actually pull back enough to have realistic possibilities. After the Soviet Union, after the revolution at least, the artists that were acting, the musicians, the community organizers were insane. The release from the dictates of the Tsar and that control of the White Army, they released amazing possibilities for human freedom and human creativity. There were musicians composing factory music, the horns and noises of factories. There were artists making sculptures out of machine parts. There were people drawing people falling out of buildings. It was ridiculous. The ridiculous needs to be brought on board as a possibility, because I think once people
I agree.
Have them, they can work backwards.
I think it does. Yeah. I think that's maybe what was being hinted at, and certainly I mean, by Mark Fisher when he came up with the term acid communism, and certainly there's a kind of how can we say ambiguous ending to capitalist realism when he says something along the lines of creativity creating fissures, cracks in the capitalist realist system, which is very Adornian in a way. And I mean Theodore Adorno, and in a sense it ties in with Adorno's concept of abstraction somehow breaking through the binaries of left and right, or somehow breaking through the false identificatory system of rationalism, which kind of fed into the mass exploitation both from the left wing and the right wing in the last century. So I think Fisher was kind of pointing at, as you say, a movement which would kind of disorientate people and somehow then help people to reconstrue society. But I think that, in a sense, and then going back to psychedelia and the way it kind of softens edges and brings people together, that is dependent on us letting go of kind of historical conflicts. So, is it really an idea of, okay, we need to be super left and kind of confront ourselves even more against the right, which seems to be a bit what's happening with far left meme making, this kind of like Stalinist tanky memes, the tanky contingent. No, but they've gone that you have a far right, so let's be the far left to the far right. But how badly did that go the last century? So we need to stop. We need to somehow seek a way out. But we need to somehow seek a way out of these kind of conflicts, which requires something completely different. And then I kind of wonder if we need to just throw away all our references and
potentially yes. And Mike, I don't want to pitch us toward. To me, the map that we're using with the far right. And frankly, most governments of the world right now, and then the far left being those monstrosities of the 20th century. I don't want to advocate for that map. Mm-hmm. I think that we can create, and I guess I might be hearing this in what you're saying, we can create a new map. Yeah,
but I also want to be clear that I'm not saying which is how it's going to be read, or it could be read. I'm not saying, okay, communism's bad because Stalinism was bad, or Stalinism in some aspects was really bad. And then, of course, there probably were positive aspects, because things are always complex. I don't want to say, okay, we need to jettison the term communism, although practically it might not be useful. There was a kind of a big victory recently in reclaiming socialism as a term. Corbyn actually said he's socialist, and the Labour Party hasn't actually used those terms for decades. And maybe we'll even regain the term communism. Who knows? How long is it before someone like Ocasio-Cortez says, I'm actually a communist, or it could be a younger, maybe it's a few years, someone else down the line. The worse things get, then maybe it's not that far away before that term comes back.
But look at the benefit of claiming socialism. Look at what's happened.
That's been really good, yeah. Well, that's been a really good thing.
I want to push that envelope further.
And I think it could happen. But I also think that my kind of Adornianism, because I am kind of Adornian in my thinking in some respects, although I think, one has to take some parts and leave other parts of all these theorists. But there's some small respects that I've taken on board. And where I kind of agree with Adorno is, in a sense that, how can I say it? He was kind of having a go at figurative art making. And he said that, if you depict suffering as a means to kind of counter suffering, so if you say like war's bad, so then you paint a conflict scene, you paint a torture scene, he says that kind of plays back into the suffering. You're making the original mistake. The original mistake being the human tendency to try and identify and capture and control experience, nature, things around us as a means to kind of making ourselves more powerful. He says that's the origin of all conflict. So you have things like the Nazi death camps as an exaggeration of the existing tendency to already identify and categorize people under wages, under wage labor. Which is a kind of extreme of the tendency to say, like, okay, this is a tree, it measures 2 meters. You know, the tendency we have to try and measure and captivate everything. So Adorno says that if you want to counter that, if you want to get out of that loop of identifying things negatively, then you need to you need to conceive of an abstract art, because abstraction is the only thing that can break you out of that false identificatory system. Now, for me, the kind of, okay, here's a hammer and a sickle, here's a swastika, that is almost the most useless kind of form of identification, that you're immediately kind of presuming a conflict. You're putting something out there just to clash. So of course you're going to end up hurt somehow, or someone's going to end up hurt. That's not like my own kind of bourgeois, I'm not even bourgeois, but it's not my own kind of Western lame-ass fear of violence. It's just that I don't see solutions coming from keeping positing the problems. So for me, abstraction is the answer. And what I like about the term acid communism is it puts out there this idea of let's make a kind of rolling carnivalesque abstraction out of society, and from that something good can be kind of thrown up. If I can use the word thrown up, expression thrown up, but something can be thrown out there. But I wonder, is that enough? Because we can do that, and that can be a lot of fun. And I'm all for maybe, trying to get a group of us together and we organise happenings that can happen in New York while there's other happenings in London. Violence. No, that's great. But just so I want to finish something that I'm all for the abstraction, but on the other hand, a lot of people who are voting Labour were like, I'm voting Labour because I've been waiting for 6 months for a cataract operation. There's old people, some women in their 60s or something, making videos, campaign videos saying, I've got thyroid problems, or something, and they want to see a doctor. They don't want to see an art happening. So I think there's various things that need to be happening at the same time. So anyway, I've gone on too long, but yeah, I think that.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to advocate violence. I want to be very clear about that. What I was trying to say is that in drawing a line, whether it's a cultural line, whether it's a political line, and whether it is an action-based, if you want to call it, violent line, I see acid communism as proposing a limit to the left, and it's not a limit in the sense of a wall you hit up against. But on a drawing, it is that line at one far edge from which you can work back. And so, when we advocate socialism, and you correctly say, socialism has become a term of parlance at this time that we can use, and that to me has changed our politics beautifully. I want to bring back terms like communism. Not that I want any particular form of communism, because those forms, the 20th century, some of the principal ones, I think were horrible. But I think there are others we could employ, and new ones we could come up with. But the point is that if you have someone advocating for that kind of very true far left position, you draw a line from which you can say, I'll pull back a little, but I'll still have a leftist politics. And it broadens the so-called Overton window in a way, whether it's artistic, whether it's political or economic or sexual or social or whatever kind of human reality we can have. And I wasn't trying to portray violence as a possibility there. I was just trying to say in these episodes, you can look at, I always, I tease people with this idea when people are discussing policies, and they're wringing their hands about the monstrosity of our current global leadership, that we always have access to guillotines. And I don't mean that, because guns are much easier. But if you just say that to people, it brings up a laugh and a smile usually, because it's a heartwarming moment to think, I could just stop this. I don't have to agonize. And if you put that as a line, or as an artist, if you look and you say, I could go crazy on this. I could create these happenings, as you said. I could create these amazing events, I don't have to be limited by the constraints of a particular gallery or constraints of a market. Those moments of explosive freedom need to be described and put into people's hearts so that they understand, like, I could just go crazy. Madness is a possibility. Absurdity is a possibility. And then I may not choose that, but I can come back from that.
Yeah,
to something more human.
And I think, I understand that. And I think it's valid. I brought up the issue of violence. I just kind of wanted to clarify why I would kind of be dubious of far left statements or imagery that hark back to the last century. And I kind of brought in Adorno there just to explain that. But just to pick up on what's happening in the comment section just now, there's someone called, I don't know how you would pronounce this, but Modus Trollens 420, going back to what I was saying before, is saying, how the fuck am I going to get my medications from a rolling carnival? Because I talked about this rolling carnival, but then I kind of got there anyway, and I said, exactly that. We have the possibility of making a kind of rolling international performance platform that can happen online and offline with acid communism, which would be great, because right now really not a great deal is happening with it. It's a term that kind of it has gained some interest, but it hasn't anywhere near gained its potential. But then surely, that's not going to appeal to the person who wants to be sure they have their medication, their education, etc., etc. Although education's also a possibility, I suppose. One can educate through art, performance, and things. But this is interesting because I was speaking with Adam the other day, not publicly, and Adam, you said something about, well, I wouldn't really expect acid communism to be, to solve everything, or for you, it's like an avant-garde. Do you remember that?
Right. Yes, I do. I got a couple things I want to say. I didn't want to interrupt y'all. I thought that was a good thing to have some friction on. To answer the question from the comment, so this is to think incredibly utopian, and I am well aware of that. But so like Frederick Jameson, an American utopia, dual power, and the citizen army, kind of described society, a communist utopian society, as a rolling carnival of sorts, yet one that breaks with, or has a strict inherent break of base and superstructure, where people are working, I think he has it as low as like 4 hours a week or something like that. And it's there's parts of it that are tongue in cheek. But the rest of your time is incredibly open. And he even says some stuff in there that really rubbed me the wrong way. Like, you've done your production quota for society. In your free time, you can be an artist. You can read political theory. You can be a heroin junkie or cook soup for your neighbors. Because that extra time isn't actually part of social, like the necessary social production for society to get along. So medicine, a living wage, and coast-to-coast transport system would all exist in that pretty wild society he is depicting there. And then so to go off of that, I kind of see acid communism as this avant-garde-esque type thing. And I think that's why Jameson's work that I was just talking about kind of fits in there, because he even openly admits it's pretty crazy. And in his other work where he's talking about utopias as a genre, you get to see a little more explanation of why that is, how they have to, in some sense, have closures or blind spots in them. And so like part of the closure element there would be separating your actual life, as into some of it you're doing this base production and some of it you are quite free, like free in ways that are hard to actually even imagine today, even though it's written out in front of you. So that kind of operates to me in a lot of ways as an avant-garde, almost acid communist type of text, where it has nothing to do with psychedelia at all, but it pushes the boundaries of thinking of what we can imagine society, how it could even exist in that way. Also acid communism as the avant-garde. So not as a movement, something that would eventually try to form a political party. I've seen it critiqued in that way, and that it's more about aesthetics than trying to build a party. But I think those things one doesn't take complete control over the other, you know. You should be doing this community building. You should be organizing at the workplace or in your community. You should be forming institutions, dual power types of institutions, and connecting with neighbors and with all sorts of people to do that type of work. And you could, or maybe should, do this work that would fall more under acid communism, that would try to expand consciousness, imagination, those types of projects as well. They don't have to be exclusive, but they can work parallel and intersect with one another at times. Like, I think that's an important thing. Like, it's often, these types of things are so often talked about as if they're completely separate. So I've also heard acid communism critiqued from the idea of a purely idealist perspective. And it's like, well, communism is a materialist analysis, or Marxism is a materialist analysis. But I think that is also ignoring a lot of key things. You know, maybe like a cybernetic turn where we consider ideas, consciousness, the way humans are interacting socially as intertwined with material reality. And how, I mean, I don't know, to say it in a really naive way, because it'd be complex to say it in a nice materialist package, how ideas can affect material. I mean, quite clearly, otherwise people wouldn't do research and write books on them.
Right.
I got a little away from myself there.
Well, no, okay, but
you're fine. I think that, you know, if Bertrand Russell said, people ask him how his philosophical views interacted with his social actions, because he was an advocate for women's rights. He was an anti-nuclear activist, and he said they don't. I simply try and be a good citizen. On the other hand, I'm a philosopher. To me, acid communism is vital in the sense that we don't have an avant-garde artistically now. We don't really have, like I said, a line in the sand. I hate those terms. It alludes to Bush the First. We don't really have that line that we can point to and people can say those are the lunatics of the left, not the imbecilic identity politics kind of academicians, but the true lunatics that you really don't want to be in charge of your society.
Yeah.
We need those.
Yeah,
then you can come back and say, this is what I want to do policy-wise. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I mean, no, it's okay. Sorry, I didn't give you very long. But I agree with that. Yeah, I think like the William Burroughs, who I don't think he was ever particularly left, but I mean, Burroughs, Antonin Artaud, these really far out people that kind of spurred people on. Maybe they weren't very healthy in their thinking, but they still kind of, well, as you were kind of saying, they pushed things to an extreme. So maybe not the whole society went to that extreme. Yeah. But one thing I want to say there, and it kind of chimes a bit with what's happening in the comments section here with this, with both T4S Gaming and Modus Trollens 420. There's this kind of skepticism a little bit towards what this would achieve, and I'm just thinking that if you look at it, you look at the avant-garde from Dadaism, constructivism, futurism, but obviously futurism was aligned with the right, with fascism. But we go on through the kind of roaring 20s, which involved a lot of drug taking, and we jump to post-war. We get on to beatniks, hippies, punk, acid house, rave, etc. It's like anything really historically. It's like looking at political movements like the miners' strikes in the 80s in England, 1968 in Paris. All these things get cited, like, why don't we go back to that? But the thing that, we could the one thing we could kind of say with all of those movements is none of them actually delivered what they intended to deliver. But they all preceded the times we live in now. So, whilst they weren't successful, they didn't, precisely because they weren't successful, they didn't stop us getting where we are today. So we could say, in a sense, that for not stopping us, they were somehow complicit, which I think is extreme. But, the question could be, how can we really expect an acid communism to achieve any more than what a hippie movement achieved? And a lot of the hippies ended up, or the more kind of sharp hippies ended up in Silicon Valley, and so you end up being kind of super capitalist. So, in answer to that,
they became acid capitalists.
Yeah, well, acid in a way, the acid right is what we're seeing in power in Boris Johnson and Trump and what have you, kind of the post-truth right. Perhaps we could see it that way. But anyway, the question is, like, how the hell is any of this going to do anything useful? And which is again Adornian, and is kind of the deep cynic in me. Just that, and then what I would say to that maybe is that perhaps none of it's going to help, but we're somehow screwed. But as long as we make art, as long as we keep creating, that's some kind of refusal to submit to the cynicism of the right. I mean, do you go along with that? That is acid communism like a place we go because nothing else is really working?
No, I don't see that at all. I see it's like I worked for a while among many horrible jobs in a shipyard as a marine pipe fitter. That's what the book I wrote was about, that strike we had. And what I did in talking and working with guys and gals in the shipyard was I was trying to get together those people, and there were many, who made art in the shipyard. But at the same time, we were walking off the job. We were working against the horrible safety regulations at work. There was a union of artistic practice, our nascent artistic practice, and a struggle against the shitheads, the awful people that we're working for. I think if you join those, where you work against your current conditions in a very practical way, and then you put together this understanding of human creativity and possibility, it may be that as acid communists, you're only doing the latter, which is fine. But simultaneously, as citizens, as people, as humans, you're doing something very practical. I think it's a union of those that really produces results.
I just want to say, there was this line, there's a Brecht line from a play, I don't remember, it may have been the Joan of Arc play. But anyway, the line is, will there be singing in the dark times? And then the response is, yes, there will be singing in the dark times about the dark times. So will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, there will be singing in the dark times about the dark times. Then you think, well, that has it cuts two ways, because then you're like, okay, well, we're living in the dark times, but we're still going to sing about it. So it's somehow good. But the other kind of way of looking at it is, well, we're living in the shitty times and we're going to sing about it because there's nothing else to sing about. So,
but there could be, in Orwell's 1984, people overlook this, but in the cafe that Winston goes to, he mentions artists exhibit their paintings there. Musicians play there. That's in the prole sector. There needs to be artists actively working on that limit, on that horizon. Horizon's a better word than limit, really, I should say, a border.
Yeah.
If there was a guy many years ago, he's a student of Russian history, much older than me, and he was describing American politicians, which I take to, except for a few, to all be on some form of the right wing. And he said they were talking about communism, and he said they would be terrified if they actually met a communist. And I think that terror, whether it's artistic or political or social, needs to be the aim of acid communism. But those people who are involved in it need to actually do things that are practical as well, that have nothing to do with this term acid communism. I think that's just the delivery of the horizon.
Yeah, I mean, and what you're saying is kind of a lot more. I know you're not being violent, but it's a lot more aggressive than what I'm saying. I suppose.
I'm not being violent, but it is aggressive.
But what I'm saying, I suppose, is, I mean, there's a point. There's a point at which you have to ask, to what extent can we do anything if we can't understand to what extent we've actually been materialized or despirited, or you could say reified, objectified. So if we've been thoroughly objectified, then anything we're doing or saying is really just the interaction between objects,
Yeah.
And then you get this thing of like, okay, but as these objects that have these thought processes that we think to be somehow free thought processes, one of those thought processes that comes up is the idea to make art. And the thing about art is it's resistant to truth. The whole thing about art is about deceptions. So that's why I think that that art is useful politically, is that we can say, okay, maybe we are like thoroughly objectified and despirited, but there's still this option of saying, as an art statement, I refuse to take that. And I know it might not be true. And no scientific method can really dismiss that, I think. But I would go on the side of there being no hope, and we use the art statement because it's the only thing that can resist no hope. Because if you do the other way around and you say, okay, maybe there's hope, what if you're just wrong and you're deluded? And actually all you're doing, all of your actions which are somehow incendiary and provoking perhaps revolutions and whatever, they're never actually emerging out of the objective whole. You see what I mean? That you're somehow, one cannot know how much they're duped. So maybe it's better to start out from, okay, I'm probably being duped by the system, but I can resist the duping because I know that I'm telling a lie anyway, because I'm an artist. And that's where I would come from, rather than a position of like, we can have one more roll of the dice and see if we can like recreate, 1848 or whatever, for the Paris Commune.
I like that. And my take on it would be a corollary, maybe, which is that not that we're being duped. And as an artist, I am speaking of a kind of my own self-duping or my own attempt to dupe, to lie through art, but that the truth that I'm receiving is the truth of a ruling class, and the truth I'm creating is an alternate truth. Like Berkeley said, I'm adding to the furniture of the world, and so with each stroke of the brush, I'm challenging God. If that makes sense. I think we're saying various versions of the same thing. Yeah,
I think we will go beyond the scope of what we can usefully do on Twitch if we get any more more into the minutiae. But I'm okay. So we have to bring Adam. We should bring Adam back in.
Yeah,
we want to bring Adam back in. So I'm just thinking. Okay, so we could go through like the philosophically how this should work, but I think we need to think a little bit about actual strategies. What can acid communism be? And it's very much an online movement. at the moment, which is not terrible, because we know that online movements have potentially shifted politics in a rightwards direction. But how might we use the online left, and is there a potential correlate in real life, IRL? So Adam, have you got any kind of ideas, strategies, how the acid left might move forward?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of talked critically and positively out of some of these already. Bringing things like what the hippies would call happenings and whatnot into real life, but also bringing some of that into more traditional community organizing in smaller amounts, and bringing not just, so to say, acid to communism, but communism to acid, to cultural events, bringing these other ideas, these pushes and yearnings for a freer society into there, not so much, or not just in content, but in form as well. So thinking as an artist, events where people are actually creating a little bit more, rather than purely consuming. Although some consumption, like going to an art gallery, is wonderful in its own right. But kind of attacking those issues from both levels. And I think that speaks to it being like earlier, like the avant-garde a little bit. Maybe, not everything you do has to be under that title, or even to link it to like Jordan Peterson's paranoia of cultural left.
Yeah.
Like, you're doing something, and sometimes you don't always have to give all those influences and secrets away, and having these almost, it's not the right word, but almost subliminal underlying messages in there can really do a lot, like when you're interacting in that cultural world. I don't know, I noticed that kind of stuff quite a bit, and I try to incorporate it into a lot of my work, and I don't know, I think it's handy. But then, but on the other perspective, bringing more consciousness raising and stuff like that into a traditional community organizing spheres. I think that's an important thing to get out there, to bring that into more important real life events, so that people are getting their medicine and having a living wage, but also expanding what they can expect or what their desires will be, so that they're not only to have a living wage under oppressive wage labor, because we could imagine a living wage that's, not really all that great. I mean, that's easy to imagine. There's probably 20 sci-fi movies about it.
But at some point, you're still a worker. And I think the point of communism was to get rid of workers, eventually to get us to this point where we could be anything, to open up these possibilities. That's why I like acid communism, because to me, the meme speaks to, like I said, a horizon at which class dissolves. And you can stuff into that meme all the wonderful lunacy that we dreamed of at one time, that, like Mark Fisher points out, we can't dream of now.
So actually, let me, how fast can I sign this? Let me read something. So this is Fisher in the Acid Communism introduction, quoting the much hated Michel Foucault among Marxists. And this is in his The Problem, Foucault said in one of his interviews collected in the book Remarks on Marx, is not to discover our lost identity, to free our imprisoned nature, our deepest truth, but instead the problem is to move towards something radically other. The center then seems not to be found in Marx's phrase, man produces man, ... For me, what must be produced is not man identical to himself, exactly as nature would have designed him or according to his essence. On the contrary, we must produce something that doesn't exist yet, and about which we cannot know and what it will be. And then Fisher goes on to say, a new humanity, a new seeing, a new thinking, a new loving. This is the promise of acid communism.
I love that.
And I think that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly what you were making me think of, and I think something that we've touched upon multiple times in this talk is that imagining of the new. But then it is also incredibly difficult because if it's truly radically other, it's nearly impossible to imagine from us. So that's where that horizon shifting and pushing the limit experience comes into play, expanding ourselves.
But look at that. You're totally right. But if acid communism is that creation of the horizon, then if you push that horizon as far left as possible, you create the possibility of a decent society that might not be as far left. It might have policies that fall somewhere in there, better than today. Like Mike said, with socialism, when socialism is accepted as an actual player politically, again, now accepted, you have the possibility of a Green New Deal, of Medicare for all. These are things in the center of the global empire, the United States, which are hard to imagine, even though other countries have at least Medicare for all and things. But these policies become possible not because they are the policies of the left, but because they're not the policies of the left. The left is way out there, and maybe you're too timid to expand yourself in that way, which is fine. But you know it's out there, and you can work backward from it. And I think that we need to, as people promoting this meme of acid communism, need to go as far into the lunacy of the antique left and the future left, maybe, and create that. That to me is the beauty of the meme. That kind of, as Mike said, and maybe I'm being too much this way, but the aggressive push of the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think can I just come in?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know what you were going to say, but because I just had a thought, and that is that a lot of this seems to be what you're talking about is trying to become something different or more than human or not human. I think there's something. I think humanity has something that it thinks that is great and that we can build on, but it's not political. I think one of the reasons we struggle so much with politics, and may even be why it tips over into conflict, is that we do have an exemplar of how things can be perfect, but it exists in the aesthetic realm and not in the ethical realm. And by that I mean that the experience of looking at something and being in awe of that thing and not judging that thing and not wanting to own that thing, what we might call the experience of beauty or the sublime, and here I'm using kind of a Kantian framework, that is a non-judgmental experience. That's the experience in which you have no ulterior motives. You're stuck somehow, but stuck in a good way, observing a mountainscape or a seascape, and there's no pretense at that moment. And I think ethics aspires after that, but we've never actually achieved it because ethics is something that's put to human ends, whereas beauty isn't. See what I mean? Ethics is a power game, really, or it's not meant to be, but in a way it can never be anything else, because this is what Kant says, without going too far into Kant, that humans, when they judge, they tend to judge, what is good for them or what is useful to them, and only in the moment of observing natural beauty or the sublime do we leave those kind of judgments aside. He couldn't ever work out how we could conceive of an ethics that wasn't somehow biased in terms of what's good for me or what's good for you. And as long as we're chasing that ideal in beauty that we're never going to achieve, we're always going to be disappointed. We're always going to fall short. And I wonder if this thing of like, you know, the thing that we need to become that Foucault says, but also Nietzsche talks about, and then Adorno talks about, this non-identity thinking. So rather than categorizing, identifying things in this kind of controlling way, we need to kind of not identify. You know, all these things are fundamentally impossible. And in that case, you know, I wonder if it's the striving for them that Foucault is looking for, that Marx is looking for, that we were never actually supposed to have the revolution itself, that all we can really have is trying for it. And is that something worthy in itself?
Mike, I totally agree. There was an activist in Louisville years ago. He was the representative for ACT UP, and he was wonderfully insane. He did all types of things that are unmentionable online at this point. And I was discussing with him anarchism, and he said publicly, anarchism is nothing you should ever wish for. He said you should always hope for anarchy, only because it's the ultimate and best goal in terms of ultimate freedom, but you'll never achieve it. It should always be that light on the horizon. And I think that there needs to be, like right now, if you look at our political reality, even our artistic reality, there's no light on the horizon. We live in a very dark time. But I don't think we'll ever achieve that. I don't see us ever achieving a real Marxist revolution. I don't see us ever achieving anarchism in my kind of class-based understanding of it. But I see the push for it as being the way toward liberty.
I'm going to start playing the music, and then I will get rid of your faces off there.
Yeah. I'll be in the chat on Twitch, which I'm sure Mike will too, but he'll be VJ.
Yeah, cheers. So the music's starting. Bye bye.
See you guys.
See you later, guys.